Welcome to While We Were Distracted, the podcast where we explore topics that often get overshadowed in the rush of daily life.
Right now, an American military transport plane trying to reach the Middle East is, well, it's likely flying a massive, incredibly inefficient detour.
Yeah, it's burning extra fuel, requiring, complex mid-air refueling coordination.
Exactly, and losing critical hours of response time. And the reason isn't because of hostile enemy fire, it's actually because the United States' closest allies are actively locking their gates and shutting down their airspace to American forces.
It is a staggering reality when you map it out. We are witnessing a fundamental breakdown in the basic logistical plumbing that makes a global superpower actually super.
Right. You kind of just assume these post-World War II alliances are ironclad. But we have a piece of reporting in front of us today that suggests the most successful military alliance in modern history is, well, fracturing from the inside.
Yeah, we are taking a deep dive into some really fascinating reporting from Axios by Dave Lawler and Zachary Basu.
And they're looking at the severe friction between the U.S. and European nations over the current situation in Iran. And they are assessing that NATO is essentially sliding into a coma.
Right. And, our objective for you today isn't to litigate the politics of the Iran conflict or to take a side on the current U.S. administration's broader foreign policy.
Yeah, absolutely not. We're keeping it strictly to the facts.
Exactly. The goal is to impartially examine the architecture of this alliance. We really need to look objectively at the friction points, the mechanical reality of what happens when allies say no.
And figure out whether this is a temporary diplomatic spat or a deliberate unwinding of a post-war security structure. Like, is this some sort of 5D chess move where the ultimate goal is a complete exit from NATO?
That is the big question.
Okay, so to really grasp the severity of this coma, we have to start with the immediate flashpoint, which is the Middle East.
Right.
The U.S. administration is furious at several key NATO allies right now. Why? Because those allies are actively denying logistical help.
They're restricting airspace and, refusing the use of their military bases for operations against Iran.
Yeah. So let's unpack this. Let's look at the actual mechanics of that. Logistically speaking, what does it actually mean to lose that access? Because it's not just a minor inconvenience, is it?
Oh, no, not at all. It cascades into a massive operational nightmare. Modern military power projection relies entirely on a synchronized network of friendly waypoints.
Right, you need those stepping stones.
Exactly. So let's say you have an operation launching from a base in the continental U.S. or maybe Western Europe. If an ally denies you their airspace, a straight-line flight path is instantly off the table.
Wow.
Yeah, you are suddenly forced to skirt around sovereign borders, flying over international waters or, the Mediterranean.
Which means your fuel consumption completely changes.
It absolutely skyrockets, and that triggers a whole domino effect. Now, you need tanker aircraft positioned along that new, much longer route for mid-air refueling.
Oh, wow. I didn't even think about the tankers.
Right, and wait. Those tanker aircraft also need bases to operate from. So if nearby Allied bases are locked down, your tankers have to fly further just to reach the strike aircraft.
Jeez, so everything just slows down.
Yeah, you lose tactical flexibility, your equipment undergoes significantly more wear and tear, and your response times in an active theater are severely delayed.
That's a huge deal.
It is. From the perspective of U.S. military planners, they are engaging in a major conflict, and the infrastructure they have relied on for decades, infrastructure hosted by nations they are literally sworn to defend, is suddenly paralyzed.
You can certainly see why that feels like a betrayal to the administration.
Oh, absolutely.
But the European allies, they're operating from a completely different set of blueprints here. They aren't just locking their airspace out of spite.
No, they have a very specific rationale.
Right. The European argument is that the U.S. launched this conflict in Iran without their input and completely outside of any international legal framework.
Yeah, they view this as a crisis in the Strait of Hormuz that the U.S. basically unilaterally created.
Exactly. And now the U.S. is demanding that Europe provide the staging ground to resolve it.
And that tension, it strikes at the very core of what collective defense actually means.
How so?
Well, the European perspective is grounded in the necessity of shared strategic consensus. To them, an alliance requires rigorous consultation before taking action that could ignite a broader regional war.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So they are pushing back heavily against the expectation that they're obligated to provide a blank check of logistical support for a conflict they fundamentally disagree with.
Especially one that lacks a UN mandate.
Exactly.
It's basically the geopolitical equivalent of, a friend starting a massive brawl in a crowded bar without giving you a heads up.
That's a great way to put it.
Right, and then when the chairs start flying, they get furious that you refuse to hold their jacket or start throwing punches for them.
Yeah, and you're just sitting there thinking, I didn't want to fight these guys. Why am I suddenly expected to take a swing?
Exactly. But the fallout from this specific disagreement is causing a foundational mutation in how NATO actually operates, right?
It really is. The alliance was engineered on a very specific, absolute premise, which is collective defense. A threat to one is a threat to all.
Right, the famous Article 5.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But what we are seeing now, driven by these airspace denials and the resulting U.S. fury, is the introduction of conditionality.
Conditionality, meaning there are strings attached now.
Yeah. The new dynamic is highly transactional. The message being sent from Washington is, well, if you won't facilitate my operations in the Middle East, I might not facilitate your defense in Europe.
Wow. Which completely changes the DNA of the whole arrangement.
Fundamentally.
It downgrades it from an unbreakable mutual defense pact to, like, a subscription service where your coverage depends on how much you helped the provider last month.
That is exactly what's happening.
But I have to push back a little on this dynamic. I mean, if the U.S. relies so heavily on these European bases and airspace for its own global power projection, isn't threatening those same allies totally self-defeating?
You would think so.
Right. Like, why alienate the people who own the real estate you need?
That is the logical paradox that European leaders are trying to navigate right now. And to really understand it, we have to look beyond just the Strait of Hormuz.
Okay, where do we look?
The Axios reporting connects the current friction back to a highly unusual historical precedent that establishes a clear behavioral pattern. We have to consider what happened months prior regarding Greenland.
Oh, the Greenland incident. This is the part of the timeline that still feels completely surreal to me.
It was definitely unexpected.
Yeah. There was an explicit threat from the U.S. to seize Greenland, which is, just to remind you, sovereign territory belonging to NATO ally Denmark.
Right.
And it wasn't just a verbal threat to Denmark. It included threats to impose sweeping tariffs on any other European allies who stood in the way. Like, wait, Greenland? How does a bizarre real estate dispute over an Arctic island connect to a military crisis in the Strait of Hormuz?
It's about the underlying tactic. If we connect this to the bigger picture, threatening to annex territory from a staunch ally, and backing it up with a threat of economic warfare against the broader alliance, it demonstrates a clear willingness to weaponize the relationship.
Oh, I see. It normalizes treating allies like adversaries.
Exactly. So the European leaders, they take that Greenland incident, the territorial threats, the economic coercion, and they stack it right next to the current fury over the Iran logistics.
And it paints a very specific, frankly, terrifying picture for them.
It forces a brutal realization in European capitals. Taken together, these events are compelling them to confront a reality they have mostly avoided for decades.
Which is what?
The necessity of building a new security architecture. They're now actively holding serious, high-level discussions about how to construct a defense structure that can function entirely without the quote-unquote American pillar.
And for 75 years, that American pillar has been the load-bearing wall of European security.
Oh, absolutely.
If they are actively trying to figure out how to keep the roof up without that wall, it means they no longer trust the foundation.
Right.
And this forces us to question the absolute certainty of Article 5. If the guarantee of mutual defense is in a coma, how close are we to a flat line?
Well, the reporting highlights some comments from Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth that really put a fine point on this.
Yeah, let's talk about that. What did he say?
When he was asked directly if the U.S. still stood by Article 5, Secretary Hegseth actually deferred to the president.
Wow.
Yeah, that hesitation alone is a massive deviation from the automatic affirmation you would historically expect from a U.S. defense secretary.
It's just an automatic yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the caveat he added was even more revealing. He stated, you don't have much of an alliance if you have countries that are not willing to stand with you.
There's that conditionality again. It's a very clear signal. He's basically saying, since you didn't stand with us on Iran, don't assume we will stand with you if the worst happens in Europe.
Right. And Ivo Delder, who is featured in the reporting, poses a hypothetical that takes this to its terrifying logical conclusion.
What's the hypothetical?
He asks, if there were an actual physical armed attack on a NATO ally today, would there actually be a political decision from the U.S. to honor the treaty and come to their aid?
The mere fact that prominent foreign policy voices are openly debating that question means the deterrence factor of the alliance is already fundamentally degraded.
Exactly. Deterrence relies on an adversary's absolute certainty of a devastating response.
Right, the guarantee.
But if an adversary calculates that the U.S. might pause, review a ledger of recent diplomatic grievances, and potentially decide to just, sit it out, the shield is already cracked.
And if the shield cracks, someone stands to benefit. Which brings us to the broader geopolitical chessboard.
Yes, it does.
The ongoing Iran conflict and the wedge it is driving deep into the NATO alliance is frankly shaping up to be a massive strategic windfall for Moscow. And I want to emphasize, this isn't just abstract geopolitical theory. This directly impacts you, the listener, sitting at home or driving to work.
It absolutely does. The fallout creates a multi-layered advantage for Russia. The first and most immediate layer is economic.
Because of the oil.
Right. Any severe conflict in the Middle East, especially one centered around the Strait of Hormuz, which is this massive global transit choke point, instantly spikes global energy prices.
Yeah.
Russia, as a primary exporter of oil and natural gas, sees an immediate and massive surge in revenue.
So while the West is spending billions on military logistics and dealing with the economic fallout of disrupted shipping lanes, Russia is just quietly cashing in on the chaos.
Exactly.
And that translates directly to higher prices at the gas pump and increased inflation for you and me, all while padding Moscow's war chest.
Precisely. Now, the second layer of this windfall is the diversion of attention.
Right. Everyone's looking the wrong way.
Yeah, the bureaucratic and military bandwidth of the United States and European capitals is basically entirely consumed by managing this Iran crisis and the internal friction it's causing.
Right.
That means their focus, their intelligence resources, and their diplomatic leverage are diverted away from other theaters where Russia might be seeking an advantage.
It's the perfect smokescreen. But the third layer is the real prize, isn't it?
Oh, it really is. The ultimate strategic windfall is the internal straining of NATO itself. Weakening or dismantling the transatlantic alliance has been a foundational goal of Russian foreign policy since the Cold War.
Decades.
Yeah. So to watch the alliance slowly paralyze itself over internal logistical disputes and conditional defense threats without Russia having to fire a single shot at a NATO member is an outcome Moscow could have only dreamed of a decade ago.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. And this leads us to the most provocative question of this entire deep dive.
Let's hear it.
We've talked about how the refusal of airspace led to threats, which led to a breakdown in trust, which ultimately benefits Russia. But what if this isn't just a tragic accident of aggressive diplomacy?
You're talking about the 5D chess angle.
Exactly. Is it possible that dismantling the leverage of NATO is actually the deliberate objective? I mean, if the current administration wants to fundamentally ease tensions with Moscow, in other theaters, say, regarding the war in Ukraine, initiating a controlled demolition of the alliance designed to counter them would certainly do the trick.
Well, that specific question sits at the very center of the anxiety in European capitals right now. The Axios reporting explicitly notes that the president is once again, quote, dangling a NATO departure.
Right.
The threat of an intentional exit is an active piece of leverage being used on the international stage. It's not just a hypothetical anymore.
But wait, I have to stop you there, because the threat of leaving NATO has to just be political bluster to get Europe to pay more for defense, right?
You'd assume so.
I mean, it would be political suicide domestically to just abandon the alliance. And more importantly, Congress literally saw this coming and locked the door.
Ah, yes, the 2023 law.
Exactly. The reporting specifically points out this 2023 law, notably co-sponsored by Marco Rubio, among others, that explicitly makes it illegal for any president to withdraw the United States from NATO without the approval of Congress.
Right.
So a controlled demolition is mechanically impossible. The law literally says no. How does a president just bypass Congress?
Well, on paper, that legislative roadblock appears completely watertight. It was designed exactly for this scenario to prevent a unilateral executive withdrawal.
Right, a failsafe.
But Ivo Dalder introduces a crucial legal reality in the reporting that blows a massive loophole in that 2023 law.
Oh, boy. Okay, what is it?
He points out that if the president decided to truly test it, to just ignore the legislation and force a withdrawal anyway, the courts could very well side with executive power over the legislative restriction.
Wait, what does this all mean? If a piece of legislation passed by Congress and signed into law explicitly forbids an action, how does the executive branch just bypass it? Are we looking at a potential constitutional crisis right on top of a global military crisis?
We absolutely are. It would definitely trigger a constitutional crisis,
Yeah.
but one that the executive branch has a historical advantage in winning.
How is that possible?
The ambiguity stems from the Constitution itself. You see, The framers laid out a very clear process for making a treaty. It requires the approval of 2/3 of the Senate.
Right. Everyone learns that in civics class.
Exactly. But the Constitution is notoriously entirely silent on the process of withdrawing from a treaty.
Seriously. It just doesn't mention how to leave one.
Nope, not a word.
So because there are no instructions on how to leave, presidents just claim the authority by default.
Exactly. Historically, the executive branch argues that because the president is the commander-in-chief and the, quote, sole organ of the nation's foreign affairs, the power to terminate treaties rests entirely with them.
Wow. Have they actually done this before?
Yes. We have seen presidents test this in the past with other international agreements, unilaterally pulling out and basically daring Congress to stop them.
Okay, so play this out for me. Let's say the president decides the European allies are completely useless because of the airspace denial, right?
Okay.
And he sends a formal letter of withdrawal to NATO headquarters in Brussels. Congress immediately sues, citing the 2023 Rubio law. It goes to the courts. What actually happens next?
Well, the judicial branch historically loathes getting involved in foreign policy disputes between the legislative and executive branches.
They don't want to touch it.
Exactly. They often invoke what's called the political question doctrine, essentially saying, this is a political fight, not a legal one, so we aren't getting involved.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So if the courts defer to the president's diplomatic authority, or just refuse to strike down his unilateral action, that 2023 law is effectively rendered toothless. President wins by default, and the withdrawal proceeds.
That is fascinating and deeply unsettling if you are a European defense minister relying on that 2023 law to guarantee American commitment.
Completely unsettling.
It means the Common NATO could become terminal purely through a technicality of constitutional silence?
Which brings us full circle to why European leaders are so urgently discussing a new security architecture. They realize that relying on a legislative band-aid in Washington is just not a sustainable defense strategy for an entire continent.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. Let's trace the thread of what we've discovered for everyone listening.
Good idea.
We started with what looked like a localized, albeit severe, logistical dispute over flight paths and military bases in the Middle East. The U.S. demanded operational support for its actions in Iran.
And the European allies firmly refused, citing a lack of consultation and fear of regional escalation.
Right. But that isolated friction exposed a profound shift in the underlying mechanics of the alliance. It's moving from a guaranteed mutual defense pact to a highly conditional, basically transactional relationship.
Exactly. And as we examine the broader pattern of behavior, stretching back to the weaponization of the alliance regarding Greenland, we saw how this conditionality is forcing a massive strategic pivot in Europe.
Right, because the ultimate guarantee of Article 5 is no longer viewed as an absolute certainty.
Yep.
And while this internal fracture widens, geopolitical rivals, specifically Russia, are reaping a multi-layered windfall. They're cashing in on energy spikes, they're operating freely while Western attention is diverted, and they're watching their primary obstacle basically dismantle itself.
All of which culminates in the very real mechanical possibility of a unilateral U.S. withdrawal, despite explicit congressional attempts to prevent it.
And this is why this matters directly to you. We are watching the potential unraveling of a security paradigm that has defined global stability and, frankly, global markets since the end of the Second World War.
It really has.
The very definition of what it means to be an ally is shifting beneath our feet. From guaranteed promises to highly conditional, frankly fragile relationships.
And, as European leaders look at this reality and actively begin exploring a defense structure totally independent of the United States, it leaves us with a critical, overarching question about the future of global security.
What's the question?
Well, if Europe successfully builds a new independent military architecture, does a more decentralized multipolar world actually become more resilient and stable? Or does removing the immense stabilizing gravity of the U.S. superpower from the European equation guarantee that a catastrophic major global conflict is eventually inevitable?
It's the ultimate test of the global safety net. I mean, if everyone suspects the main insurance provider is looking for a legal loophole to avoid paying out, they all start building their own local fire stations.
That's exactly it.
But whether those local decentralized fire stations are coordinated and equipped enough to stop a massive geopolitical forest fire, well, that is something the world might be about to find out. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the headlines, keep looking at the mechanics behind the news, and we will see you next time.
Don't forget to like and subscribe for the next episode on While We Were Distracted.